welcome to you all here for this second lecture of the NCCR On the Move public lecture series. It seems that less and less people are here in this large room, and I hope more are connecting on their small screens. Tonight, I have the great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Lea Ypi in the framework of our public lectures. So as you might know, the topic of our series is human movements and inequalities. And among different approaches, we really wanted this topic to be addressed from the perspective of political philosophy and specifically by Lea Ypi. She's professor of political theory at the London School of Economics, and as an immigrant herself, as an expert of the philosophy of Kant and of theories of justice, of Marxism, she has made an impressive effort to draw on the tools of political theory to clarify and criticize the terms of the debate that we have today on migration. And she has done so in a volume edited with Sarah Fine entitled Migration in Political Theory, The Ethics of Movement, and also in a recently published essay called Border of Class, Migration and Citizenship in the Capitalist State. In my view, one of the main contributions of Lea Ypi is her capacity to bring back the question of social class in the debate about migration, which is often reduced to open versus closed borders. And this is precisely what she will be speaking about tonight. And she will address this progressive dilemma between openness to immigration on one side and support for the welfare state on the other side. And she will defend a model that she calls class-based solidarity, and to offer an attractive response to this progressive dilemma. She will be speaking for about 45 minutes. And then my colleague and dear friend, Jean-Thomas Arrigui, who is senior lecturer here at the University of Neuchâtel, will discuss her presentation for about 5 to 10 minutes. Finally, we'll open the floor to the audience here in the room and also to our YouTube correspondents. So until about 7:45. So Lea, your talk is entitled Solidarity, Immigration and Social Class, and I very much look forward to listening to it. The virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for having me join remotely. I'm going to talk about the progressive dilemma around immigration. And I'm going to talk about progressive skepticism about immigration, which may not be grounded on racism, on xenophobia, or on scaremongering about the threat to liberal culture, but which is no less troubling, I think, than the conservative arguments against immigration that we tend to hear. And I want to talk about why that progressive dilemma about immigration is troubling and what kind of form it takes, and try and dispel some myths and respond to some objections around that. I think it's troubling because, like the conservative critique of open borders and immigration, it takes both a pragmatic and a principled form. So in the case of the pragmatic argument, there are appeals to strategic necessity, to electoral politics in representative democracies, where we are told everywhere in Europe and beyond, progressive parties continue to lose votes to the far right in traditionally working class strongholds that become increasingly susceptible to anti-immigrant rhetoric. And so on the one hand, we have the conservative argument that speak to the failures of globalization and that blame it on liberal elites' relaxed stance on open borders. On the other hand, we have progressive that become complicit and confused because they are caught, on the one hand, on the imperative to fight and win elections on anti-immigrant arguments that appeal to the common sense of the public, and on the other hand, some kind of loyalty, traditional loyalty to principles of equality and inclusion that have universal scope. So that is the kind of pragmatic dilemma. But there is also a more principled question. And the principled question is on some kind of trade-off between being open to immigration on the one hand and support for the welfare state on the other. And here we are often told that immigration often highlights the distributives and the cultural conflicts that might lead to eroding social justice in the long run. So from a distributive perspective, we are told immigration increases pressure for jobs, access to healthcare, housing, schools, and undermines the position of vulnerable citizens who might depend on the welfare state, welfare subsidies to maintain their lives. And from a cultural perspective, on the other hand, we are also told large-scale immigration brings cultural divisions that might undermine the kind of trust and solidarity that is required to uphold social justice and to stabilize democracy in host states. Now, of course, immigration scholars will tell you that if we take this evidence at face value, it is actually shaky on both distributive grounds and on cultural grounds. So often the evidence that immigration undermines the welfare state is at best inconclusive. But the problem is that even if social scientists are right, and the empirical evidence shows that immigration is not objectively an obstacle to the development of the welfare state, this doesn't prevent forces, political forces, to invoke it as a threat in public discourse. And so that anti-immigration discourse then ends up shaping both public policy and the kind of political projects that we are called to vote on or deliberate on, and so shapes the nature of our democracy. So I think addressing this dilemma in a way, regardless of the empirical arguments in favor or against, at a more sort of principled level, is important both from a pragmatic perspective, if we're thinking about how do we shape resistance to exclusive political movements and to xenophobic forces in society, but also from a principled perspective that asks us to try and find an alternative and a different path to social change. So far, the response to the progressive dilemma has been to kind of take seriously the nation-state model of solidarity and to try and find ways of responding to these challenges and to try and adapt that model to the circumstances of contemporary politics. And from a principled perspective, the two most prominent avenues are what we might call the multicultural model of solidarity on the one hand, and on the other hand, the supranational model of solidarity on the other. So I'm going to speak briefly to each of these models, and then I want to defend, towards the end of my lecture, a third model, what I call the class-based model of solidarity. And what the class-based model of solidarity does is it doesn't extend or complement or try to internally modify these other two models, the multicultural and the supranational model, but it actually tries to offer an alternative to them that is at the same time a kind of principled alternative, but also in some ways a political alternative, a way of looking at our political world and trying to make sense of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the shortcomings, or what I see, the sort of short description and the shortcomings of both these models, and then I'm going to turn to the outline of the class-based model to try and explain what the benefits I think are to exploring that relationship to the ideal of political community that we are kind of familiar with. So I think the main shortcoming of the multicultural and the supranational models is that instead of challenging the nation-state model of solidarity at their core, they try to make it either internally diverse, as in the case of the multicultural model, or to enlarge it, as in the case of the supranational model. So the EU is a very good example of a supranational model. It seems to me that both models rely on a kind of ideal of cooperation that is based on a traditional way of understanding the combination of territory, sovereignty, and population, and both reflect a kind of distribution of obligations between members of this territorially defined unit in light of pressures of migration. So what is the critique? The critique of these models to the national state model is that both agree that under democratic conditions, we need to kind of shape joint political institutions that consolidate forms of decision-making and collective attachment that take a kind of civic national form. And civic nationalism here relies on two ideas. On the one hand, the idea of popular sovereignty, which helps us think about how do we distribute social justice obligations amongst members by relying on the law. And on the other hand, mechanisms of civic education, which facilitate the endorsement of these democratic norms and that stabilizes through long-term historical educational processes the boundaries of these democratic units. So what the multicultural and supranational models of solidarity do, they both try and start with a reflection on political community that takes for granted these two features and tries to extend civic nationalism by developing alternatives which give us kind of both preserve the benefits of that model, but reject its limitations. So on the one hand, for example, if you think about the multicultural model, the idea is to reject the ideal of national solidarity that is based on shared culture and to develop a sense of multicultural belonging that is sensitive to the differences between ethnic communities present in the territory and often through migration fluxes. So the challenge is to basically turn the nation building model into a multicultural nation building model, to have a nation that is internally differentiated. And on the other hand, on the supranational model, the aspiration is to reject the ideal of national solidarity in favor of the construction of larger, bigger supranational units able to better respond to the challenges of globalization and to expand the kind of system, the nation-state system of rights and obligations. So both accounts, I think, are right to emphasize that the nation-state model of solidarity has led to a kind of entrenchment of particular forms of ethnic and cultural identification, which turns to unjustified immigrant exclusion. So often the civic national model has been hijacked by ethnic nationalist projects. And so they're right to find reasons for criticizing that model. But I think in developing alternative proposals, none of these models actually challenges the idea of solidarity that is based on what one might call political culture. So a kind of model that reflects on the constraints of how we understand political community in light of the parallel development of a global market society, which I think would be the challenge, to try and think about the development of nation-state models in connection to the development of global market societies. So the problem is that, as I see it, is that the multicultural and the supranational models revise the kind of concept of political membership that is at the heart of the nation-state model, but preserve the political ideal of a kind of forum of democratic cooperation which generates its own forms of attachment. And so neither of them actually challenges the idea that there are obligations of social justice that apply only between the members of these cooperative units, but not to outsiders. And so basically, the kind of compliance and the special obligations of social justice that the nation-state model generates is simply transposed to a different level and to this reformed either multicultural model or supranational model as they adapt the ideal of political community to changing circumstances. So I think this point is really important. The fact that this, the very model of solidarity that is at the heart of the nation state is simply transposed to this other way of understanding political community, either the multicultural one or the transnational one. So I want to explain that point a little bit further before I sort of unpack what I think we could be looking at as an alternative. The nation-state model of solidarity is historically based on a kind of appeal to shared language, to history, and to political tradition in giving us resources for discharging political obligations and for making them sustainable in the long run. So the multicultural model does exactly the same thing, except that it argues that we need more languages, more histories, more traditions. And so when we reflect on how to consolidate political cooperation with a bounded political community, what it does is simply differentiate the nation-state model of solidarity. And on the other hand, the supranational model also, on the one hand, challenges the nation-state model, but on the other hand, it just expands that ideal of social cooperation to the supranational sphere. So what it does is that it says we need to expand the territory and the channels of political cooperation by creating structures of decision-making that respond to the challenges of globalization and that enable us to expand social justice obligations beyond the nation state, looking, for example, into the European Union as a model of transnational solidarity. The problem, as I see it, is that both of these models actually generate their own forms of neglect and exclusion, and are also based on a sort of unilateral reading of history of how national solidarity is constructed, and insufficiently critical of that history. So in the case of the multicultural model, this affects the social groups that are not represented in the different cultures that make up the new multicultural state, whose identities might cut across the distinct ethnic cultures recognized by the multicultural states. The different ways of thinking about what a social group is. Some of these ways are cultural, others may not be cultural in the way understood when we relate culture to an ethnic culture, but the multicultural state doesn't reflect on that. And in the case of the supranational institutions, this takes the form of recognizing that there are special obligations and granting special rights and privileges to the members of that supranational cooperative scheme, but not to those situated outside. And again, one excellent example is the European model of freedom of movement, which is recognized between member states, but of course is severely restricted and, as you know, harshly policed when the claim is made from the outside, and that gives us a pause for thought. So, as I see it, the problem with both these models of solidarity is that they rely on a kind of ideal of social cooperation that I think is insensitive to the asymmetries of wealth and power and to discursive resources that characterize power relations between citizens of the same state and across different states, and that are in many ways tangential to issues of cultural belonging. So these models are based on a narrative of the emergence of social solidarity that I think that is an ideal narrative that would have been warranted if obligations of social justice had been the result of cooperation between free and equal citizens, if the what we call liberal democratic state had actually been the site of this cooperation. But the problem, as I see it, is that the liberal democratic state has very rarely been either liberal or democratic with regard to all those subject to the power of its institutions. And the fact that the liberal democratic state has historically consolidated in parallel to the development of a more globalized civil society and the expansion of market structures that take a global form means that actually the state's internal legal and political structure and the juridical forms of cooperation between states have entrenched these asymmetries of property distribution, these hierarchies of power, and these forms of exclusion. And so this has led to a merely formal recognition of equal rights and obligations with very little substantive benefit to the most vulnerable social groups. Often even the legal recognition has come late, as think about civil rights movement in the US, and even that recognition is the subject of hot contestations. Think about the recent protests around Black Lives Matter and so on. So it seems to me that except for a few cases that are very rare and very fortunate, the liberal democratic state has always been the struggle of conflict rather than cooperation. And in this struggle, the idea of the nation and the compliance with shared social norms or collective attachment to these jointly shaped institutions has often been instrumental to the consolidation of elite projects of subordinating vulnerable minorities, both domestic, as in the case of women or workers or people of color, and internationally, as in the case of vulnerable people in the colonies. So, why does this all matter? I think it matters because when we think about the progressive dilemma around immigration, we need to take the liberal democratic state as it is historically. And that means that we need to think about it outside the kind of idealizations and inaccuracies of the multicultural and the supranational models when they reify that kind of ideal of political cooperation, which is in tension with the historical reality. And I think what we would see is if we had an alternative, more nuanced and a more historically sensitive analysis of solidarity, we would realize that solidarity often emerges not as the result of strengthening of universal, powerful processes of social recognition in the nation or in the name of a kind of shared political community, but often as a result of the development of struggle by those that are subject to power relations that don't take a territorially bounded form at all. So, in other words, we need to think about solidarity as emerging from the kind of shared action of people who have experienced shared oppression, or who identify with people who have experienced a shared oppression, and that is a more historically nuanced account of how political solidarity actually develops in actual conditions of oppression, which would also show us that then solidarity is not grounded on particular ethic of social membership, but on a politically coordinated effort to develop political resources for overcoming shared oppression. So, of course, some of the scholars who defend these models, these alternative models of multicultural and supranational solidarity, often acknowledge this. So they often concede that solidarity is often historically, and as a matter of real politics, not a question of developing joint allegiance to shared political institutions, but the effort of kind of building social and political movements that mobilize and fight for their purposes. And they also concede that when these goals are realized and benefit all the citizens, this is not the result of a kind of ideal of social cooperation that the nation state embodies. So then they respond to when they respond to the progressive dilemma, they say, yes, of course, as a matter of history, the obligations of social justice that characterize a welfare state, we know are the result of strong labor movements. We know they're the result of efforts of trade unions, or we know they're the result of the electoral gains of left of center political parties and the sort of overall struggle of activists. But if we take that for granted, if we start from there, rather than just acknowledging that in passing, we would understand that there is a different alternative explanation, which is grounded for the emergence of political solidarity, which is really at odds with the nation-state model, also in the way in which it's recuperated by these efforts to revise it, these kind of revisionist interpretations. And so, if we take seriously that point, we would come up with an alternative understanding of how political solidarity is built, and we would come up with an account of solidarity that runs along lines of, I think, social class rather than national cultural belonging. So I'm going to return to what these implications are of understanding solidarity along lines of class rather than nation-state belonging in a short while. But what I want to explain now is to try and explain first the difference between the class-based model and the multicultural model of solidarity and the supranational model of solidarity. So the two revisionist efforts of the nation-state model, as in the class-based model, are really alternatives to each other. They're not really complementary. It's actually very hard to make them complementary. And I want to press on that because I think while the critics of the nation-state model, the multicultural and supranational critics of the nation-state model concede the arguments that I've been making about the importance of conflict in a political community and so on, I think the reconciliation between these models, between the class one and the nation-state one, is not as straightforward as the critics receive the effort. And I think the reason is that these models are actually in tension with each other because the ideas of political community on which they are based are also different. So in one case, the multicultural and the supranational model, the political community is understood as a system of cooperation where legal and political institutions give us a kind of distribution of social justice, which makes these sustainable through shared cultural practices. But on the other model, on the class-based model, the political community is understood as a site of conflict between groups which have different power relations and whose power relations result from the different position in the economic, legal, and political structures that make up the globalized world. So on this account, on my account, classes are neither pre-existing social groups that are exclusively determined by particular economic processes. So it's not a purely materialist account of class, but it's also not a purely voluntarist account in the sense that classes aren't just contingent aggregates of social opportunities. There is a kind of historical legacy in class formation. And they result from processes of class structuration that are shaped by asymmetries in ownership and in social power, and by the influence of political, juridical, and ideological factors that regulate relationships between groups in a global market. So this is very general account, but and I think because it's general, it's hopefully also uncontroversial. How exactly we should understand social classes, what the relative importance of economic factors is in these processes of class structuration, how do class belonging and class awareness relate to each other are very large questions, and I'm not going to address them here. What I want to focus on, though, is on the kind of progressive dilemma, return to the progressive dilemma in light of this alternative model of solidarity that is based on class. Because my contention is that most of the existing literature, but also most of the existing political agents, including progressive leftist political agents, always start by taking for granted this cooperative model of political membership and always analyze migration as a problem of membership too. So in the kind of dominant models, migration is a problem because the asymmetries and inequalities that shape the international sphere, where many of the differences between states or between the citizens of different states are related to political membership. So a state's level of development, the system of rights and obligations that membership in it makes available, and so on. But if you start with a class-based model of solidarity, then migration is not a problem because the question is not political membership. Migration is only a problem in the context of a global process of production and distribution of goods that is shaped by the circulation of capital and the distinctive national and global juridical and political relations that enable its social reproduction. So, on this account, the asymmetries of power and wealth that globalization under capitalism generates produces social conflicts both in developed and developing states. And of course, the way in which different classes of people are affected by these conflicts in these countries is also very different. So poor citizens of rich countries and poor citizens of poor countries are both negatively affected by similar phenomena of deindustrialization, digitalization, productivity crisis, regardless of where they are, even if they are not affected in the same measure, and even if more local factors are relevant. And likewise, rich citizens of rich countries and rich citizens of poor countries often benefit from the advantages that ruling elites can extract from the state, even if there is a great degree of variation in the way in which these distinctive legal and political orders shape the particular balance of power between social classes. So, in all these cases, the strength of the organization of the labor movement, both internationally and intranationally and internationally, affects the kind of distribution of power relations between states and within the state in the international arena. So what are the implications of then turning to the question of migration by thinking about the model of solidarity that is based on social class rather than political culture? On the multicultural and the supranational model, an immigrant worker and a domestic worker are distinguished by their membership in different political communities. And the question is one of political belonging and to what extent the advantages of political belonging should be granted or not to outsiders. And the idea is here that because membership matters, the relevant social movements and political forces that represent domestic workers have stronger obligations to cater to domestic workers than they have to immigrant workers, because allegiance to a shared political community takes priority. So on the class-based model, agents in society who defend the concerns of workers don't have a principled reason to prioritize workers who share political membership vis-a-vis immigrant ones, because the axes of conflict are global and the symmetries of power that are conducive to these global processes of circulation of capital are responsible for migration tensions in the first place. So the response to the conflict should also be global. So basically, the fact that many progressive political movements in liberal democratic societies are reluctant to mobilize on behalf of foreign workers and struggle to kind of involve them in their domestic campaigns can't be explained just on strategic grounds. It's the overall social structure, the system of economic incentives, and the competitive political environment in which they operate are such that they discourage foreign workers from exercising their voice and discourage domestic political movements from assigning any kind of priority to them. Trade unions are organized on a national basis. The barriers to mobilization of the most vulnerable migrants are extremely high. They're often particularly tied to special types of visa or to particular work conditions. So progressive parties and social movements can only mobilize successfully if they shape public policies that advantage workers, and they can only shape these policies if they win elections. But to win elections, they have to appeal to a constituency of citizens where from a purely legal perspective, divisions of class are irrelevant, but political membership is crucial. And this is how these alternative models become extremely powerful vehicles of political mobilization domestically. So if these structural constraints weren't in place, the principled case for showing more concern for domestic workers wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. But because we're prioritizing social justice obligations within the political community, and because we're distinguishing between foreign workers and domestic migrants along cultural lines, this ends up undermining the cause of migrant workers from a global perspective. So where the dominant models of political solidarity make space for class-based considerations, and they sometimes make space, they make this concession, they say, well, yeah, maybe it matters. They do it by suggesting that it is in principle possible to pursue strategies of solidarity that are based on political membership and strategies of solidarity based on social class at the same time. But I actually, I want to reject that concession. I want to say that I actually doubt that this can be the case, because the two models, the nation-state model and the class model, aren't just incompatible, they actively undermine each other. And this is the sort of the next step in my argument. The more we align with the political membership model in either its multicultural or supranational form, the more we undermine the class-based model. If we take class analysis seriously, we ought to also revise our account of solidarity in the political community and also the theory of distribution of social justice obligations that comes with it. So the main obstacle in these alternative models comes from their very acceptance of the terms of the progressive dilemma as it is introduced, and the very endorsement of the question of whether immigration undermines the welfare system. Once you accept the framing, it's very difficult to come up with alternative steps. Because that very dilemma, the very raising of the question of does immigration undermine the welfare state, is premised on an effort to distinguish and to pit domestic workers and migrants workers against each other in a way that only makes sense if we think that their primary loyalties are to their respective political community. So this is why it's really important to understand that if we think about migration and if we think about relationship between migration and the welfare state, we need to think about migration in historical terms and in connection to the developments of global political and economic processes that produce migration in the first place and that give it its particular shape. So it's impossible, for example, to speak about the reality of migration in isolation from, let's say, the legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism in countries that have benefited from the exploitation of labor and resources in the ongoing asymmetrical regimes of economic exploitation in different parts of the world. So we know that migrant workers often come from geographical areas and from political communities that haven't recovered from the history of colonial violence and exploitation by the wealthiest European states during the period of accumulation of capital and consolidation of liberal political institutions. What is often forgotten is that that historical injustice continues in the present. So similar patterns of appropriation of land and resources and labor power are pervasive in the asymmetric relationship between developed countries and developing countries in the form of favorable trade deals, debt dependency, brain drain, and so on. So this is why it's often, and there's a kind of, when Marx first wrote about the relationship between English workers and Irish workers, he made similar remarks to explain that often, to the extent that immigration is instrumentalized and hostility to immigration is instrumentalized by ruling elites to turn these workers against each other. Marx said, for example, when he talked about the difference between English and Irish workers, that in relationship to the Irish, the English felt themselves members of a ruling nation and so became a tool of exploitation of the capitalists of his country against Ireland by strengthening their domination. So when migrant questions come up, native workers identify with their state. They neglect the kind of exploitation by ruling elites and their hostility to it, and they become defensive of the rights and gains associated to liberal parliamentary democracy. And so what happens is that when progressives accept the argument that foreign workers threaten domestic workers, they also implicitly endorse an image of the state as a unitary system of cooperation where advances in rights and claims by social groups give them the kind of historical rights and privileges that they are now entitled to enjoy. And if we were to take a look at the question from a more historical perspective, this is where, for example, practices of colonialism and historical injustice and reminding ourselves of these practices of colonialism and historical injustice is really important. Because while on the one hand, working class struggles for decent pay and workplace rights have played a very important role in guaranteeing domestic workers' rights, it's also really important to think about what have been the enabling conditions that have ensured that domestic elites could occasionally make concessions to the working classes of their countries because of the structural conditions that enabled the enrichment of these societies against the background of historical practices of exploitation and violence in other parts of the world. And so one example is, for example, the current international order and the asymmetries that pervade the international order. The political manipulation of more vulnerable states by their former colonial masters is a kind of persistent feature of our current international rights regime, which have inherited the same hierarchies and power and wealth that characterized historical colonial relations. And so the working classes and welfare states regimes of hegemonic states have benefited from this advantage. And that advantage and that history, the kind of unjust history that pervades the accumulation of these advantages, is often forgotten when we think about how then workers claim the fruits of their labor in the context of protecting the rights and privileges of uncontrolled migration. So the other issue so this is the kind of the importance of the legacy of historical injustice in thinking about the relationship between domestic workers and migrant workers. But the other issue that is really important is actually a present perspective. So the progressive dilemma often emphasizes how migration is especially a problem for the vulnerable citizens of liberal democracies, and it often highlights how it benefits wealthy elites who can take advantage of the cheap labor that migration makes available. And so this is what often progressive leftist political actors would say. They would say it's a real dilemma because it arises out of a kind of necessity to prioritize commitment to social justice, which recognizes that we have a kind of distinct obligation to the most disadvantaged citizens of our own communities. And so we must first discharge those. And these are the arguments that you would find among left-wing parties who voice skepticism towards immigration in various European countries, Germany, France, and so on. So this way of looking at the question, which again pits the interests of migrant workers against the domestic workers, gives another distorted understanding of the role of social class in relationship to the state. And so, again, here, if we turn to the history of Marxism, we would see that there's resources in that tradition to help us draw attention to the kind of devastating effects that the division between domestic workers and immigrant workers has on the mobilization of the class of workers as a whole in enabling overcoming capitalist exploitation. So, and what is really important on that tradition, on the class-based perspective, is to understand political conflicts as conflicts not between states and groups with different cultural profiles, but between different social classes. And so this is why it's really important to understand this marks a departure from, again, traditional ways of thinking about what are the relevant collective agents in world history sort of engaged in struggle with each other, where for most of the Enlightenment tradition, these were nations and states. But on the sort of Marxist account, we see that the agents of struggle are social classes. And that's also why the class-based model of solidarity differs from the liberal account that is based on membership. So, and the reason it differs is that from the point of view of the class-based account, both the multicultural model and the supranational model will fail to sort out the conflicts that migration generates unless it also intervenes to fix the inequalities of power and the hierarchies between social classes at a global level, both between states and within states, and these levels are always interconnected. So the problem is, though, that focusing on political membership, we are unable to fix these asymmetries because the model constantly emphasizes contractual agreements instead of power relations and cooperation at the kind of units of, at the agreed unit of political cooperation rather than conflict. So different social classes will, if we think about the social class model, different social classes will demarcate different collective alignments with regard to global process of production and exchange that are also historically specific alignments. And what is important on this model is to understand that class conflicts also often cut across state boundaries. So what does an analysis of politics that is based on class rather than political and cultural identities is it informs an analysis of the state which acknowledges that social roles, different social roles are played by different political and economic elites that uphold this global system of capitalist exploitation. Now, I mean, to sum up, this is, of course, not to deny that states make and enforce laws, and that the condition under which they can do so is the exercise of jurisdiction in a particular territory with specific boundaries shaped by distinct political culture, and that any working class movement would have to take into account of these constraints in organizing and thinking about strategies of resistance. But what I think the focus on social class gives you is that the moral weights of the distinction between migrant workers and domestic workers ends up being revealed parasitic on the moral weight of the identification of the cause of workers with the cause of the workers in the state in which they happen to live. And that is just a contingent association, and one which has we have no principled reason to support. And so the arguments that we would make would then be completely pragmatic arguments to do with how much more effective or less effective can the struggle be if it mobilizes in the national arena along national allegiances and so on. But it wouldn't be a principled question about prioritizing the working classes, domestic working classes, at the expense of immigrant workers. And so to say that migrant workers are a problem for domestic workers is basically, from a principled perspective, just to take responsibility for domestic workers and not for migrant workers. And so ultimately it's to ignore the global structural conditions that turn migration into a problem in the first instance. And so as I see it, the trouble with the progressive dilemma and the reason why the models of solidarity that follow this progressive dilemma are inadequate is that they reduce social conflicts to conflicts between states and their citizens that are defined along cultural lines. And so the model artificially creates a kind of we of domestic workers, which has certain rights and benefits that must be protected, and them, which are the foreign workers that we need to control. And so the division between foreign and domestic workers ends up being the kind of narrower application of a larger division which reifies identities based on culture and undermines the kind of joint struggle of working classes around the world. So this opposition, to conclude, between foreign workers and domestic workers and the kind of reification of the state on which it relies is, as Marx said, the secret of the powerlessness of the working class despite its organization. The more we emphasize solidarity based on political membership, the more class-based solidarity is undermined. And when class-based solidarity is weak, the prospects of joint action that are based on the shared nature of global oppression by capitalism are annihilated. And so this division then ends up playing in the hands of the ruling elites and is actually, as Marx also explained, artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, by the papers, by academia, through, as Marx put it, all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. So the real threat to the labor movement aren't foreign migrant workers, and it's also not the debate on whether borders should be open or closed, because it's false to say that borders only pose a problem for vulnerable domestic workers and are welcomed by ruling elites. Under capitalism, employers don't favor the movement of people as such. What they favor is the movement of people without rights. So they favor the workings of an agency like the capitalist state, or a capitalist state with reliant on multicultural or supranational institutions, which can unilaterally control practices of entry and police borders so as to render both migrants and native workers vulnerable to the discretion of ruling elites. So this is why, to separate the problem of admission of immigrants from the problem of integration, and to campaign only for the rights of existing migrants, but not against current state policies of border control and migration management, ends up strengthening the liberal capitalist state and in the long run disempowering the workers. And so to endorse the terms of the progressive dilemma in thinking about solidarity means to accept that we must be reasonable and to acknowledge the pressure on borders. And this in turn means that we end up aligning with the capitalist state against the working class. So the exclusion of migrants from the workplace and from access to welfare rights is enabled by the exclusion of migrants at the border and the discretionary powers this gives the state. So I think the last thing that a progressive movement that cares about the fate of workers should be doing is to support a project that consolidates the capitalist state rather than trying to undermine it. The threat to domestic workers aren't migrant workers. The threat is a capitalist state which protects the interest of ruling elites through these practices of border management and policies of integration that render migrant workers dependent on the whims of employers. And so their shared vulnerability is the mechanism through which domestic workers are kept in check and through which the bargaining power of unions is undermined and through which the kind of reserve army of unemployed workers, of which Marx also spoke, increases its ranks. So the management of migration by capitalist states and the divisions it introduces between domestic and foreign workers is really the kind of secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power. And without challenging the model of solidarity and political community on which that secret is based, it's very difficult for progressives to take steps in the right direction. So where solidarity is constructed as allegiance to a joint cooperative process of shaping a shared political community, then the alternative model that built on class-based solidarity ends up inevitably undermined. And that alternative model is the one that we should be resurrecting, or that progressive political agents who are interested in inclusion and universal ideas of equality and so on should be resurrecting for their political struggle to be more effective. And I will just end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lea Upi, for this fascinating talk. I'll give the floor to Jean-Thomas Rigui right now, who has about 5 to 10 minutes to discuss your paper. And afterwards, I'll let you also answer to his comments, and we will finally open the floor to Q&A from the audience, if that's okay. So Jean-Thomas, you can go on with your comments.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Lea. I think I can gladly say that I am not the man behind your invitation, but I very much suggested and pushed for your name when we discussed potential guests for this year with Robin Stunzi, and you certainly haven't disappointed. So let me perhaps start by saying that I'm not a political theorist. I'm a political scientist. I have an interest in normative political theory. So, you know, a lot of the stuff that I'm about to say might just be plainly wrong from your own disciplinary perspective. The second thing that I want to say is that I fully agree with you. I think it's about time that the left revamps the old class-based argument, so basically goes back to the roots. And the third thing that I want to mention is the fact that I took a lot of notes. I mean, I read your paper, and I must say, because I feel you put your finger on so many things that I believe myself, but that are not very clear in my head. And I took a lot of notes, and I've been struggling with your paper for quite a few days. So you did clarify quite a few points with the presentation in my mind, because I think they're clear enough in the paper. But most likely I will mumble through my comments because they're not very clear in my mind. So hopefully you'll figure it out. So if I sum up your argument, or I think your core message, and perhaps I'm wrong there, but you know, it's always difficult to put one's own words in the mouth of someone else. But I think basically you want to reiterate the core message of Marx, which is workers of all countries unite. You want also to reaffirm the predominance of the class over alternative systems of classification, chiefly nationality in your case. But I think you can think of, you know, alternative ways of classifying the world, such as ethnicity, but also perhaps more controversially, such as gender. And perhaps another thing that you want to do, because it was not very clear to me, what was your straw man? What do you want to argue against? And I think it's actually quite limpid, because you say so in the introduction. Your straw man is basically the other progressives. Your straw man is the progressives, under the umbrella term, who fall under the umbrella term of the team of the multiculturalists. Basically, what you want to say, I think, what you actually say, is that we know that there is a trade-off, or there was a dilemma within the left between the politics of recognition based on identity and the politics of redistribution based on class. And you probably want to argue that they've gone too far in the politics of recognition, not far enough, or they've largely given up on the politics of solidarity, so the politics of redistribution, and that by doing so, actually, they have reinforced the nation-state paradigm that pretty much starts from the premise that nationality or national differences and cultural differences trump other forms of differences, such as those based on different socioeconomic status. So I want to make 3 comments, and I'm not sure, it might take a little more than 5 minutes, but I want to make 3 comments that hopefully will help you. So it's a very important argument. That's what I mean. It's not a small paper. It's a very important argument, and therefore you have great responsibility. You need to make sure that it's as tight as possible. So let me perhaps suggest 3 ways of doing so. The first one, the three concerns that I have, or 3 comments that I have. The first one is, where do you stand along the realist versus ideal spectrum in normative political theory? It's not very clear to me, and it has implications for the way you will frame the argument. The second one is, what progressive dilemma do you have in mind? I think you spelled it out in the first place, but actually it seems to me that there are 3 sub-dilemmas, and they're distinct answers from a class solidarity perspective. And the third comment would be about the need to emphasize the implications, and the very positive and virtuous implications of the class-based argument for native workers. So let me start with the first comment, which is probably the least interesting and the least relevant. But I think it's important to clarify where you stand. To what extent is it a principled discussion, and to what extent is it a realist discussion or a realist argument that you want to make that takes into account real-world constraints? So if you intend to make a principled argument in an ideal world, then you can disregard real-world constraints. You merely focus on the dilemma, and you try to deconstruct it from a class-based perspective. I don't think this is what you do. It seems, and you say it in the first place, you say it at the beginning, it seems that you care very much about what you call the pragmatic argument of the progressives, that electoral politics dictate to basically go against their core ideological commitments and endorse the fact that there has been a defection of working class voters from their traditional affiliation with the left to radical right parties, and they have basically to compose with this electoral reality. So it seems that you actually want to make a realist argument. And you do so, it becomes quite clear in that discussion when you debunk basically some of the myths surrounding the historiography of the multiculturalist, chiefly Kim Lika, that fashions a very highly stylized history of the welfare state as being the product of a common nationality, basically. I think it's actually Arthur Miller who made the argument in the first place. So the idea is that a common nationality is a prerequisite for enforcing mechanisms of solidarity between those who have and those who have not. And it's quite clear that it's completely detached from what political scientists know about the emergence of the welfare state in Europe. It is very much about a class struggle, and you say so, but I think you should really cite, the canonical text around such as Esping Anderson, such as Steinrock, and made very clear that there was no such thing as common nationalities when the welfare state first emerged. There was, on the other hand, a very heightened class conflict, and the welfare state, and therefore the enforcement of those mechanisms of redistribution across class, were a way of mitigating this class conflict. It was a social democratic response to this class conflict, and it's very well established in the empirical literature, and therefore if you want to make a realist argument, you should engage more thoroughly with that literature and probably signal that this is taken for granted by people who do not inhabit the world of ideas, but the messier world of of politics, basically. So that's one thing that you might engage more thoroughly with and cite more this empirical literature. So the second, which I think is more important because it's for the logical coherence of your or internal coherence of your demonstration. It seems to me that there is not one dilemma, but there are three dilemmas. So let me try to find that in my notes. It's extremely massive here. There are three dilemmas. Right. So there is an alleged trade-off between immigration-induced cultural pluralism and welfare solidarity. So this is Kim Lika's culturalist argument. And the idea is that, so it starts from the premise that a common nationality is indispensable for enforcing mechanisms of distribution. Multiculturalism disrupts this idea of a common nationality. And this is what he calls the corrosive effect. Multiculturalism or cultural diversity corrodes the kind of natural, organic, Weber would say, solidarity that there is within the national group. The second dilemma is not about culture. It's about an alleged trade-off between domestic workers and immigrant workers. Immigrant workers already settled in the territory. And then you mentioned a third dilemma, especially towards the end of the paper, and this is where I would probably disagree a bit more with you. Then it's because it's a trade-off between domestic workers and prospective immigrants, therefore immigration. And I think if you apply your class-based model to all three sub-dilemmas, you will actually have to make a slightly different demonstration. So let me start with the first one. It's the easiest one. Kim Lika's corrosive effect, the idea that multiculturalism erodes the kind of organic solidarity. The problem is this critique has already been done. If you think, for instance, of a book which I think is brilliant by an egalitarian, of course he's not a Marxist, but he's very liberal egalitarian, Brian Barry in 2001, an egalitarian critic of multiculturalism. And there the idea is that multiculturalism reifies cultural differences, and by doing so, it inhibits the development of cross-cutting cleavages along class lines. So he says, well, the problem is you can have a culturally diverse society and you can have solidarity. The problem is multiculturalism is not about, the fact that all societies are increasingly diverse, so that they've always been so. It's about emphasizing those differences. And it tends to undermine the possibility of seeing the emergence of class-based affiliations transcending cultural differences. So this is an old kind of egalitarian argument. I think in the 1990s, at the time of the multicultural debate, some Marxists have argued that actually multiculturalism is a conspiracy, is a capitalist conspiracy for dividing the working class. So it's very clear that a class-based model, as you propose, would definitely provide very strong solutions to that alleged trade-off, which I don't think exists in the first place. Then the second trade-off is between native workers and immigrant workers already settled in the territory. And there, if you really take into account scholarship, you would see that this has been largely solved. We always think, I think in the discourse, in the political discourse, we have this idea that immigrants and native workers have different rights, but the reality is that the rights of social citizenship have been largely decoupled from nationality and extended to non-nationals on the basis of the principle of territoriality. So this is something that we know from the work, for instance, of Virginie Gordon in the early 2000s, but it's been reiterated not so long ago by some colleagues of ours from the University of Liège, Daniela Vintila and Jean-Michel Lafleur, who clearly show that when it comes to social rights and social entitlements to social rights, there is hardly any difference between natives and non-natives, and mainly between citizens and non-citizens in Europe. So we see perhaps some rising signs, of a stronger marker when it comes to social rights. But fundamentally, when it comes to contributory benefits and all contributory benefits, there is no difference. And there is no difference. Why? Because the welfare state was very much premised upon labor. Entitlement was based upon labor. If you work, if you contribute, then you will be entitled to national solidarity. So we see that empirically and historically, the development of welfare state is very much more premised upon work and upon class divisions than it is upon nationality status. And it's very resilient, which I think is a very counterintuitive finding, gauging by, alarmist discourses. Then you have your third dilemma, and there I would probably not follow you. You say that there is no trade-off between solidarity and immigration. And so basically you take a realist view, a Marxist view. And I think you're right if there is such a thing as a worldwide dictatorship of the proletariat. There, indeed, if the world is no longer organized in territorial nation states, but is organized in classes, so transnational classes, then indeed immigration becomes irrelevant. The problem is, in the world, in the real world we inhabit, we still have borders, we still have territorial nation states. And there you could not really make the case that the old economic Marxist argument that immigration can be used as a way to break strikes, to weaken class solidarity, to put pressure upon domestic wages, etc. It is still very much present. And I think it would be a very hard sell to explain to work in North America that this is not the case and they should just, go for open borders. Because in the world we live in the world you probably envisage in the long run, after Le Grand Soir, that might no longer be the case. But in the world we live in, it's still very much the case. So, the maximalist argument is that it's possible, but I think the minimalist view, taking into account real world constraints, makes it much more difficult to make that claim. So let me perhaps finish with one thing: why class-based solidarity is so important, and why your argument is so important. So, I'm a middle-aged white man, and I'm not from a working class background, but I have some friends from a working class background. And the problem is, the dominant historiography is that the fact that they are working class is irrelevant, because they are men, and they have the nationality of a powerful country. And it completely, I think to them, it's a double bin of history, of historiography, basically. Because what happened in the 19th century is that, and even now, is that you are right, class-based affiliations. The poor, those who don't have, whether they are in Europe, whether they are in the rest of the world, doesn't matter. They are still subjugated to a power structure. They are still neglected populations, etc. And I think that the problem with the nation-state paradigm, produced and in some respect perhaps even expanded by Kimlicka and the multiculturalist of the politics of recognition, is that they place native workers, white native workers, in Europe and in North America under the impression that they are winners. And that is not the case. And I think this alienates those people. If you see in the States, for instance, you have an anthropologist who published a book about the underlying mechanisms of the Trump vote in some traditional bastions of the left. And in his interviews, what comes out is that a lot of people who traditionally voted for the Democrats are very frustrated by this idea that because they are white, they are winners. They are not winners. They are from the working class. And indeed, a form of politics that would place the emphasis on class affiliation over other systems of classification would probably help them return to their traditional ideological affiliation or marriage with the left. Right, so, but that requires an historiographical effort to basically revisit history by showing the predominance of class over nationality in shaping the struggles that you discuss in the paper. So I'm not sure it's entirely clear. It's not entirely clear to me, but to conclude, because I've taken way too much of your time, this is a great paper. I have those 3 comments and suggestions for improvement, and thank you very much for bearing with me for about 9 minutes.
Okay, great. Do I just respond? I can't hear the convener. Okay, I assume that I'll just respond. So let me start with the overall. Actually, let me start with the general question around who is the target of my paper, in a way. And I guess the target of my paper is well-meaning social democrats and progressive left activists and political theorists, politicians, organizers, who I think have implicitly endorsed some of the standards of commitment to kind of liberal democracy without realizing that I think there is a trade-off between principled social democracy, which is what I would like to resurrect, and liberal democracy as we understand it, as many of these parties have ended up understanding it now. So the target is well, as I say at the beginning of the paper, the target are progressives, leftist political actors, political theorists who worry about migration. And the effort and the aspiration of the paper is to say that that the left shouldn't worry about migration, that in fact, if you raise the problem of migration as a worry for the left, you've already committed to a number of steps, theoretically and pragmatically, to which you shouldn't be committed. And if you're interested in kind of resurrecting social democracy, if you're interested in making it a progressive project again, then one should retrace the steps and rediscover a kind of a shared core of the original social democratic project, which is very much a project that centers around recovering class rather than citizenship. And so thinking about social democracy as a kind of global revolutionary project rather than as a kind of revisionist nationalist project that it has become historically. There may be other more radical progressives, people who wouldn't necessarily identify themselves as social democrats, but for other reasons would subscribe to some critique of liberalism, some critique of globalization, but would then end up, as I say in the paper, for the sake of defending domestic working classes, subscribe to some worry about migration. And again, the effort in the paper is to try and dispel those worries. So where do I stand? Let me start with the methodological question. Where do I stand on the realist versus ideal spectrum in political theory? I think for anyone who is concerned about migration, there can be no discussion around what is the level here. Because if we're talking about migration, we're not talking about an ideal problem. We're talking about very much a real problem. And we're talking about a political problem. And the reason we talk about it is that it is framed as a political problem in the everyday public opinion to which we are exposed. What happens, though, is that in our analysis of migration, we make assumptions, and our assumptions are often based on generalizations and abstractions, and also assumptions about the values to which we are committed. So what my paper tries to do is to reflect critically on the assumptions that we make when we think about migration as a problem. And this is where the level of intervention is not an ideal level, but it's also not just an empirical level that says, well, let's look at whether actually working class parties, how they fare electorally, whether they benefit, whether left-wing parties really benefit at the voting booth from their anti-immigrant campaigns. And so that's why then the level of discussion is not a purely empirical level that just looks at statistics and electoral comparisons, but it's a level that tries to think about what kind of abstractions and generalizations are we using in thinking about the models of political community on which our assumptions about whether migration is a problem or not are premised. And so this is why I take the point that you make. There is an empirical literature which talks about the importance of the nation state and the importance of social class in the making of the welfare state and the consolidation of the nation state. And I'm very happy to sort of incorporate suggestions from that literature. But one concern that is neglected on that literature is the question of how do you distribute responsibility depending on which model of political cooperation you rely on and how you think about political cooperation. And what I'm trying to reflect on is to come up with a different model for distributing political responsibility based on certain assumptions that I think should be in place when one looks at the world from a particular perspective, in this case, sort of radical left egalitarian perspective. You can call it what you want. I mean, politically, people would say social democratic. From a theoretical normative perspective, we would talk about egalitarianism and so on. For me, these are overlapping categories. Okay. So what is the progressive dilemma? One dilemma is, as you say, is the question of cultural unity and the question of multicultural, cultural critique of multiculturalism. I'm fine with the liberal critique of multiculturalism, and so I'm fine with to some extent, the liberal critique of multiculturalism, I think, goes too far in criticizing multiculturalism when it doesn't think about different categories of oppression when comparing different national groups. So I think it should be extent that Barry and people like that already make the argument that arguments by the working class and so on, arguments that I also make, I'm fine with that. And if that's not controversial, I'm also very happy to kind of incorporate and be on the same side. The other question that you raised, which is about domestic workers and immigrant workers, where you argue that there is a kind of empirical literature that says that social citizenship right has been, social rights have been decoupled from nationality. I would say, I would be more cautious with that claim. I'd say, first of all, that is not the case with a number of categories of migrants. So temporary workers, distribution of benefits, immigrants that are tied to particular working visas, depending very much on national context, these restrictions in the degree to which they can participate politically and to which they have access to social welfare benefits, although context dependent, I think there's good arguments for saying that it's not exactly the same as domestic workers. And the most glaring difference, where I think it's also very important not to divorce social rights from political rights, is access to citizenship, where we see that in the way in which citizenship is extended to newcomers, there is very much a kind of class-based discrimination, where citizenship acquisition is extremely easy for with people who do citizenship by investment, for the rich and so on. But there is a number of layers of class discrimination, in particular discrimination against working-class migrants, which takes the form of access to citizenship in terms of multicultural tests and so on, but also in terms of how much they need to earn, how much, what kind of commitment is required from them in order to deserve citizenship. So I think if you look at citizenship, there are very important differences between migrant workers and domestic workers. And if you think that political participation should be connected to access to social rights, even in the most benign, best case scenario where migrants do have access to social rights, which is something that I would dispute, because I think there is a lot of context in which that is not the case, and it's increasingly less the case that migrants have access to social rights, in part as a result of the campaigns of far-right populist parties and so on. I would say that even in the best case scenario, which might have been the case, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, it's important that we don't decouple social rights from political rights. And so it's important that asymmetries of citizenship are also highlighted. So domestic workers and you saying, the world is still, domestic workers and prospective immigrants and immigration, you say, well, the world is still organized in territorial nation states and we still have borders. My argument is not that the borders that we have and the existence of states is not important. My argument is that the conflict that we experience in the globalized world that we have are very much parasitic on class conflicts. But we neglect them because we only think about conflicts in a globalized world as conflicts based on nations and states, and we think of responsibilities as responsibilities that are primarily the responsibilities of states. There's a lot of, again, literature in political economy, economic literature, which talks about, why do nations fail, all the dependency, the earlier theories of globalization around trying to think about how does a successful state become a successful state, how does a poor state ends up bearing responsibility for its plight, are all, I think, discourses and interpretations of globalization that come at the expense of marginalizing the class-based perspective, which would give you a different reading of globalization, the asymmetries of globalization, and the relationship between processes of historical injustice that have led to the consolidation of certain international institutions and processes of structural injustice. All of these discourses, I think, are marginalized when we think about globalization as focused exclusively on the nation-state paradigm. So I'd say that even if you're not convinced that the class-based model is an alternative to the nation-state model of solidarity, we should at least make space and we should at least acknowledge that there is this alternative interpretation that would lead us to a different diagnosis of the political conflict that we have, and to also identify the solutions in a different way. I think you're right to say that to some extent there's a worry that if we focus on migrant workers and we say, well, migrant workers are bearing the plight and so on, and we think about the kind of how the welfare state has benefited white working classes, then they end up being presented as winners, and that in turn, something that you didn't say, but I think it's also important to add, that in turn risks empowering the right, when the right plays with the vulnerability of domestic workers and says, well, look, you're actually a victim, but they're saying to you that you're a winner, and so now I am the agent that can respond better to your concerns and so on. I think what's important there is something that I don't focus too much in the paper, but that I think would be interesting for future research, and this also speaks to something that you said at the very beginning of the paper, is to try to think about oppression as a question of intersectionality. So I don't think it's useful and productive to isolate, when we think about the development of capitalism, to isolate questions of class from questions of gender and race. I think in general, if you are a black working class woman, it's much worse than if you're a black working class man. It's much, which is in turn much worse than if you're a white working class man. And this is in part because of the way in which these intersectional dynamics of oppression and these the historical processes that has led to the consolidation both of capitalism, but also a group of kind of core capitalist states that have ended up benefiting mostly by dynamics of capital accumulation, are the result of these processes, which, as I say, are intersectional processes. So what one needs there is an effort to explain that the difference between workers, domestic workers and migrant workers, is not a question of, it's not about income. It's about being in the same position of oppression in a shared global order that is ruled by capitalist institutions that operate with a certain rationale, and which rationale ends up depriving and oppressing people, both the women, the black, and the workers, and that these categories are not exclusive. What is also really important, though, is that when you recover this, you also recover, as I say, the class-based interpretation as the axis through which one can read these conflicts. And this is something, again, that progressive left-wing parties in many advanced Western democracies have failed to do, in part because their logic has been always national. They always worry about, in part, as I say, for the pragmatic reasons, they ended up voting and participating in elections, and so having to make particular arguments that can drive forward their electoral campaigns. But I think in part also as a result of the loss of discourse and the loss of understanding of social democracy as a kind of project that can be revolutionary and that is actually transnational rather than nation-based. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I take my comments back. Thank you very much for your answer. I won't take any more of the time. Hopefully, we'll meet again to pursue this conversation one day. But thank you.
Thank you.
I will take a few questions in the room if there are some, and afterwards we will turn to the yes.
Thank you, Lea, for being here. As you see, we are all with masks, and probably my brain is too little to understand both of your English turbo, which is very fast and very complex in the development of your eloquent ideas. I was also, basically, I had sometimes the impression to be one of those socialist clubs of the late 19th century, discussing between the internationalist socialists and the more national-oriented working class organizers of unions. Because basically, I would say the progressives, the left, is not a monolithic bloc. They have had the differentiations and variations within. And the problem of the left in the 20th century has been basically that they were attacking each other and killing each other in order to organize a better world. And it didn't work. So my reflection on what you were saying is, where is the empirical basis, historically proved, of your political theory? Because if I'm looking at the developments of the 20th century, then obviously there is a reason why there has been a national welfare state as a compromise between a defeated revolutionary socialist group and a paradigmatic change of the social democratic parties just before, during, and after World War II, in order to organize at least a national compromise when it came to the working class solidarity institutions. And what Jean Thomas basically referred, which has also been taken over by the late Michael Bomas, is basically how the welfare state was eroding exclusive nationalist takes on the welfare state, because the contributors were being part of the social citizenship, and that way they became also part of the welfare. I think you have a point in the take in seeing the limitations of these models, but I don't see empirically how class can become again the category which will organize the future.
Can I just ask for clarification on that? So why do you think that is the case?
Because historically it hasn't been the case, because his class assumes at least that there is an awareness of a common past and a common destiny. And this has been, for all working class movements, the basic problem, to create this awareness, because there is also an internal differentiation. Jean-Thomas mentioned basically white working class who are not feeling themselves as being part of a common organized group, but can also see the issue of social mobility. Who is saying that working class of the 50s will remain working class in the year 2000 or 2020? Basically, your approach is addressing the fact that there will be a common block which will never evolve. Maybe Bourdieu would possibly follow your picture, but I would say that there has been, nevertheless, forms of social mobility which have differentiated social classes, also migrants within these social classes. And for that reason, it's difficult to maintain the idea that there is a common awareness and a common interest, because interests are shifting. For that reason, I don't see basically the empirical basis of your assumptions, but maybe I'm wrong and you are right.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for pressing me on that. So let me maybe explain where I think there is a slight disagreement between us in the interpretation of this movement. I think, first of all, it's important when one thinks about the history of working classes and the history of the welfare state, that we understand that this group, these organizations, didn't always exist. They were created. They weren't there, and then they were created. And they were created as a result of political effort, political mobilization, discourses, the shaping and the emergence and the sophistication of ideologies that helps them campaign. And so they were in many ways constructed out of discourses that weren't always there. In fact, often against the background of hostile discourses, against the background of liberal propaganda against them, against the background of injustice and so on. So that for me is one reason to be optimistic, is just to think of history not as a history of defeat, but actually as a history which may have ended up in defeats at various points, but whose beginnings are very promising and in some ways actually give source for hope, because we see that it is possible when there is political will and when there are discourses that help movements shape their ideas in the right way to actually make a difference. The second, I think, aspect on which maybe there is a slight difference between us is if you think about the kind of the history of the working class movement again, is that I would say that it's not the case that workers are inherently drawn to national discourses. I think, and I don't think kind of nationalism is inherently more or less attractive, in part because I think in the emergence of national movements, these movements were themselves created. They were often created by intellectuals, by elites, by groups who were fighting a kind of old order, whether it was imperial order and so on. Anyway, they were also themselves the result of construction. So they weren't always appealing and always there. There was no tradition. These traditions were all created. They were often, Pilsudski, the famous nationalist, used to say that it was the state that created, the famous Polish nationalist used to say that it was the need for a state that created the nation rather than the other way around. So if we think about the history of the nation state, why does that matter? Because I think in the case of what we might consider the success of working class movements, the fact that these movements began as international movements was a source of strength from when they operated domestically as well. In other words, I think they were effective domestically because they continued to have this international inspiration. And I think that is a model, or at least I see that as a model for reflecting now in terms of what does one need to recover, to regenerate this progressive message in the left. I think returning to the spirit of this kind of old internationalism in which we look at the international discourse as a source of strength for domestic discourse rather than something that undermines domestic discourse is, I think, something that would end up empowering also domestic working classes. So this is what I'd say I'm a bit more optimistic, and I'm more optimistic that insofar as there is a change in discourse and that one helps shape that change in discourse, that can have positive and promising outcomes for the for domestic political struggles, but also for the coordination of political struggles. The last thing on which I wanted to comment, which is something that I've been working on for a very long time, I'm really interested in, is the relationship between what we might call reformist and revolutionary movements. And I think it's time for us now to take stock that if we're talking about failures, both of these groups have actually failed. I think it's true that the revolutionary project has historically failed, but I don't think the revisionist projects are faring much better. I mean, if you think about the state of the world as we face it now, social democratic parties across the world are in deep crisis. And that is in part of crisis of identity. They don't know what they stand for because they have lost both their roots, but they've also lost the kind of the history of success of the post-war period in which they could go around and kind of win electoral advantage, confer advantage for a series of structural transformations that we don't need to go into. So I think when we think about recovering the history of the left and recovering progressive discourses in society, I think you're really right to emphasize the diversity of views within the left, and I would very much agree with that and sort of emphasize what you're saying. But I also think that it's important in acknowledging those differences not to see that one project has won and the other has failed. I think both of them have strengths and weaknesses, and part of taking those campaigns forward is, I think, to try and make an effort of building on the strengths and weaknesses rather than isolating one and the other and saying, well, this one's clearly worked, this one has clearly failed. I think this is where, creativity comes in a way. So the effort to think through this history and to try and appropriate its lessons for the future.
Thank you very much. Other questions in the audience? I don't see any questions on the chat right now, but maybe, yeah. It's, sorry?
Is there time for one?
We have one question, let's say one question here in the room, it's okay. And one question if there is one in online. Yes, Lorenzo.
Thanks, Leo. My name is Lorenzo. I'm speaking on behalf of a minority. I think it's only 5 people here in the room. I was thinking at some point of his discussion, Jean-Thomas mentions that he has some friends who belong to the working class today. And I was thinking of my friends who belong to the working class today. They're actually working in, what is called the gig economy, Uber, and those kind of services. And I was considering what, to me, looks like a paradox, because in my view, working in those sectors is making collective action much more difficult because people are completely atomized. And I find this paradoxical because you are basically calling, might be a call to arms or a call for people to actually partake in a collective effort to dismantle certain injustices at a time when, again, this seems just more difficult than it was before, where there were trade unions and forms of organization. On the other hand, perhaps you see this as an opportunity because in many different countries, those people are dealing with the same problem and the same challenge, which is a new challenge. And so they might, come together on a transnational platform rather than nationally. I'm not sure this makes any sense. I'm a complete alien to those debates. But again, coming from this generation, I think it's very important to bring in the debate also what is labor today and how it might be transforming the idea of class. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so that is a really important question and a really important debate. Again, I think it's one on which it might be instructive to think about the history of these movements and how they are shaped. And where I think I would agree with the last part of your remarks, which is to say that, yes, it is true that work is now atomized. It is true that there have been changes in the kind of composition of the labor force and changes in the way in which workers socialize or fail to socialize. And that this requires a change in political strategy in the modes of organization. Having said that, I think that calls for adapting struggle in a way rather than abandoning it. Because on the other hand, if we think about the kind of injustices of the world that surround us, those injustices are still there, and the dynamics that perpetrate these injustices haven't actually changed all that much. So the technology has changed, but the mechanisms of ownership or the mechanisms of accessing certain advantages in the distribution of the means of production or whatever. So the means of production have changed their nature, but there are still asymmetries in, you know, who works and who owns data, who owns internet companies, and who owns Uber, who owns the kind of the gig economy. So there is, to some extent, I would say, there hasn't been a qualitative difference, as I say. There's been a kind of change in the nature of the way in which labor is organized, the structural composition of the working class, and so on. But I think this calls for adapting the political agents and the nature of the demands, rather than saying, well, we're in a completely different era where it makes no sense to, because, as I say, the injustices are still there, and the injustices are still perceived to be there. And part of the effect and the formidable success that right-wing parties have is parasitic on those injustices becoming more and more obvious to us. So I think it's important to kind of take stock of where we are and think about how can one adapt the changes in the nature. I say, think a completely different set of issues that we haven't encountered in the past, and where I think it would be instructive to kind of think about the history of the emergence of these labor movements as a source of potential inspiration for how one might go about, but also adapting to the change in technologies.
Yes. Thank you very much for this. I'll take one more question from the YouTube audience, and afterwards we will close because we are running late. Leslie Ader asks, would the class model provide a better alternative in terms of creating, retaining solidarity for vulnerable migrants? And she mentions here migrants with disabilities, for example, or what we call vulnerable migrants.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is part of the argument I'm trying to make, right? Is to say that I think the class-based model would give us a better alternative insofar as it would enable us to challenge the premises of the discourse. And so then one wouldn't focus on this distinction between migrants and non-migrants. One would then focus on the shared oppression and the shared characteristics of these subjects to these processes of globalization that I've been speaking about. So I think it would provide a better alternative, at least insofar as it would enable us to diagnose the problems that we face from a different lens, to use a different lens in diagnosing the problems, and also to reflect on political responses with that different kind of framework. That's it. I'm not hearing anyone anymore.
Sorry, we will close here. I have to juggle a little bit. Sorry. I'm with my mask here. Oh, okay. Good. So thank you very much, Léa, Upi, and thank you, Jean-Thomas. I will cut your just for one. We will close the YouTube session, but